Welcome to the 1% Insight. Today, I'm joined by Alan Gleeson, a B2B marketing consultant who specialises in SaaS. Alan started his career in financial services, joining Barclays on their graduate program. Since then, Alan has gone on to work with some major technology companies, assisting with their B2B marketing strategy with his consultancy company. This is a conversation you won't want to miss. Welcome to the 1%, Alan.
Thank you so much, Jack. Delighted to be here.
So let's go back to how it all started, how your journey in marketing and B2B marketing began.
Yeah, I actually studied it in university. Lots of 4Ps back in the day in kind of a BCom and UCC, Jack. Completely different to the world we live in now, but it gave me a very good grounding in the foundations and the kind of fundamentals. But the weird thing was, Jack, there was no digital back then. There was no B2B SaaS. Actually, the closest thing to it was what was called industrial marketing at the time, because the academic side was very focused on, consumer and B2C. So it was one of those cases, Jack, of, the world was very, very different back in the 90s in terms of career and opportunities in marketing. So very much a case of not what I planned, but sort of where I ended up by dint of the change in the world, I guess.
Obviously, there's been huge change, obviously, in the last kind of 4 or 5 years in the digital landscape, and that's been accelerated for different reasons. How have you noticed, I guess, like there's always the battle between B2C versus B2B, and B2B is kind of getting more light now, but how were you kind of focused on B2B and serving those customers, maybe when it wasn't as popular as it is in 2024?
Yeah, like I started in banking, as I think you mentioned at the start, and it was actually the business side of the bank that I was working in Barclays. Um, and actually, the way the internet sort of took off, it was definitely businesses were quick to jump on board, which kind of, they were the first people with websites, and there was an explosion of SaaS once the internet, got fast enough. And actually, I can remember, Jack, when I sold software as boxes of software in a retail store. So you'd go into PC World or Staples and actually buy software off the shelf. So sort of very, very kind of different sort of scenario. I guess I kind of ended up in B2B. It tended to be a lot of jobs in it. A lot of software applications initially, as I mentioned, were targeting businesses. Why? I guess businesses spend a lot more money than consumers, right? And, there was a kind of a natural tendency for enterprise applications. So I guess accounting software was one of the first ones to take off. And then in recent years, we've seen a complete explosion in B2B. I guess for me, there's quite a lot of differences, but there's also similarities. I mean, with B2B, you're obviously selling to more than one individual. The buyer and the user can be very different as well. And it's probably less about, leisure or entertainment, and often can be more around enterprise type applications, time savings, efficiencies, and so on. So I guess there's just been, and naturally a lot of B2B companies, and that's kind of where I found my niche. And I guess the other thing, Jack, what's interesting is that there's now almost a transition to the next wave, which is the start of the B2B SaaS. But now, personally, I'm working with B2B clients that are in professional services or in other technologies that aren't SaaS. But you can kind of take some of the lessons you learned on the sort of software side and put them into good effect with professional services and other B2B companies.
It's a really interesting transformation that's kind of happening now. Kind of area that I'm in is more around the content side of the B2B function. But recently, I think, was at the Cannes Creativity Festival down in France. LinkedIn put out like a B2B ad, which is obviously the Cannes kind of festival is very B2C, the big brands orientated, but LinkedIn put out they launched an interesting B2B kind of documentary, almost like Netflix style. And it was really interesting, kind of documenting the journey of B2B since the kind of 60s, 70s to where it is now, and it kind of changed. So it definitely is an interesting space to be in. And even on LinkedIn, you'd even see it. There's a lot more people going into it from college. Now they're kind of seeing that, especially with tech, that there's really interesting opportunities within the B2B marketing space. So
actually, one of the difficulties is there's a little bit of a disconnect between academia and the kind of the emergence of B2B SaaS is kind of where a lot of jobs are. So again, a lot of curriculum and a lot of academic case studies are very B2C orientated because, of course, as you mentioned, it's easier for people to relate to big brands like Netflix or Nike or Adidas or whoever. So I think there's still a bit of a gap where It's kind of viewed as the poor relation in terms of academic stuff, but then when you hit the real world, it's kind of, there's almost an inverse correlation whereby the jobs are predominantly in B2B.
There was actually one lecture we had in MTU, formerly CIT, and he kind of taught specifically B2B. But like when we were in, we were just like, we didn't even know what like B2B was, even though when you look at it and you kind of strip it back, like most of the transactions being done on a daily basis are B2B, like it's kind of fueling everything around us. And obviously we see the flashy B2C in terms of the iPhone in your hand, or, the Adidas runners on your feet or anything along those lines. So it's just kind of, I guess, being immersed in it to see the full extent of how B2B kind of makes the world go round. So I think there's some interesting opportunities there. And that kind of leads me on to the next part of it, Alan, which is the challenges, firstly, of B2B marketing, and what, I guess, what challenges B2B brands are facing in 2024, and how that looks over the next few years, in your own opinion.
Yeah, and again, I'd probably stay in kind of use the lens of Ireland or the UK or Europe, and also SaaS, because that's probably where I know best. I guess one of the big challenges, Jack, is they're often resource constrained compared to American counterparts, right? So most of the B2B SaaS world is fueled by VC cash, right? So a lot of venture capital money comes in because you've got to go through this initial build and getting everything prepared and ideation and sort of product market fit. So a lot of cash gets consumed in those sort of early stages. So you do need decent raises. And I guess one of the challenges in Ireland and the UK is often these pre-seed or seed rounds, as they're known, are quite, small, again, relative to the US. So you kind of have to get a lot further with a lot less cash. And of course, your early hires are invariably developers and product people. So, marketing is kind of the poor relation, a little bit. So like one of the challenges is definitely around resourcing, where going back to the academic stuff we talked about at the start, Jack, brand awareness being a classic example, right? It's easy to do brand awareness if you're a consumer product with deep pockets and big marketing functions. It's very hard to do things like brand awareness for smaller, more obscure companies with more limited budget. So that's definitely a key issue, which is around just resourcing, adequate budgets. Because the flip side, which is the next point, Jack, and I'm sure you'll have some views on this as well, right, is it's almost getting more difficult each year to do things without budget, right? And by that I mean, when I started my career, it was relatively easy to do some good search engine optimization yourself to have a fighting chance of getting onto the first page in Google. And back then, you didn't have the heavy amount of links and snippets and all that stuff on the homepage that were invariably now commercial ones, right? So, and then you look at things like LinkedIn and Twitter or X and some of these other channels, right? The organic reach is diminishing each year because these platforms get more and more commercial, right? So I think there are some of the things that are going on. I remain optimistic, right? Like everything, there are definitely opportunities, but I think the key one is making sure you're adequately resourced from day one. And that's actually counterintuitively, it's quite tricky at the moment because in some ways we're in a sort of a funny period that's, particularly in tech, right? We had those interesting years a few years ago around, 19 and 20 when interest rates were rock bottom. Lots of cash was flooding in. Lots of companies were getting big checks. Not so much cash going around at the moment. So there's definitely a trickier context. So a mix of things, Jack. But I don't know. Are you seeing some of these trends as well yourself?
Yeah, I suppose I can only speak on the content side of it, and mainly the social media marketing element of B2B. But I think it definitely is a challenge for founders and smaller B2B teams, less than 10 or 20 people, to make that difference online. Some companies have one or two people maybe that can take on that workload of maybe starting that podcast, writing the newsletter. They don't mind getting on video, and they're trying to get the brand awareness function out there in terms of getting out to the top of funnel activity to benefit ultimately people going through that process and getting onto your website. But for a lot of people, especially probably in Ireland as well, kind of giving that comparison back to the US and Ireland, the US are probably more open to doing that. They like to speak a bit more. They don't mind being on camera. They're probably more, and it's more in their nature, I think, probably for content. Whereas maybe with the Irish, we're a bit more reserved sometimes when it comes to creating content. So it can be more difficult to get on camera, and that kind of creates an issue then, because they don't necessarily have the budget to hire a new face of the brand, if even if it was just an influencer who they're bringing in or partnering with just for content purposes. They don't have that resource allocation, especially if they're not even getting any funding. They're just bootstrapped. So I definitely think that's something challenging, but an interesting insight that I'd like to get your take on as well is, I've been seeing this trend of people building kind of communities of their own. So obviously, social media platforms can be taken away within an instant. They could just be banned, or for whatever reason, it could just not go your way. So people are building kind of their own communities, kind of closed off on different channels like Slack or school.com or something along those lines, Discord. Um, how do you see that kind of developing in terms of brands taking their audience offline almost while still online, but just in a different kind of environment where they're building a community of people in their target audience?
It's a great point, Jack. I think there's kind of two ways that I think are worth thinking about when you look at that, right? I think this notion of personal brand versus corporate brand is an interesting one to explore, right? I think we're all getting a little bit jaded of, corporate channels, shall we say. I look at my own personal behavior in recent years online, and let's say I don't really engage with corporate accounts on Twitter or LinkedIn. I increasingly follow who I think are interesting people, and they may be linked to certain brands or they may be in certain companies, but there's a kind of a clear gap between them. So I think that's the first thing that I think will continue to grow. Throwing up a corporate LinkedIn page or a corporate Twitter or whatever, I think will have a limited appeal. But having a CEO or founder or someone that you said earlier that was willing to be the public face of the brand, doesn't matter how small the company is, but just a face behind it will be important. Second point you made, which is a very important one also, is there's definitely a kind of growing sense that all these platforms are turning the dial slowly but surely against you, right? So because they're free platforms and they're monetizing, so therefore, I mean, I was fortunate enough to actually get on LinkedIn back in 2003, where Reid Hoffman was a guest lecturer where I was studying, and he talked about his new startup LinkedIn, and I was on in it right at the start. And in the early days, it was a completely different platform to it is now, right? There was no such thing as infinite scrolling or no such thing as news feeds. It was just a very clean interface, and over years, it kind of degrades the experience for those users that are on it, and we all get frustrated with it now. So to your point, there is a lot of value in creating your own community, as you call it, right? But I'd go so far and say that actually newsletters are one that you didn't mention, which I think are increasingly important. You can see things like Substack growing in importance, because if you can build an audience and you can kind of essentially own that audience, it can't then be taken away. And like anything, it can grow over time. Now, the one thing that with all of these, Jack, that's again important to recognize is these are not quick wins, right? So you got to be really clear up front. If you're going to go and pursue these sorts of tactics, there has to be a long-term perception of them. There, it takes a while for video content or podcasts to get any traction, right? And you see lots of people will give it a go for a couple of months and will then determine, I'm not staying on the game because I'm, not able to move the figures in the right direction. And I think, that's something to be aware of. There's an inherent tension here that you kind of have to get in these in for a long-term commitment and make peace with yourself. So I think part of it is communicating to stakeholders before you embark on any of these ideas, that you're being open and transparent, that if there's an absence of budget to go and spend in terms of paid acquisition or whatever, these are alternative options, but the payoff can take quite a while before you can get an audience size that's a decent number. Yeah,
That's especially when it's not paid, for example, when it's more organic, like you mentioned there, like the newsletters or the organic social content or the podcast. It does take quite a lot of time. And obviously when you have funding, or if if it's a funded company, they don't necessarily have the luxury of waiting 3, 4, 5 years of a content plan to start taking into effect, they need fast relevance of it, which can be a challenge, obviously, to a lot of B2B companies that have funding. Early on, they need to get results to grow the business and keep everyone happy. So definitely not easy for B2B businesses at the moment, but there is opportunities, like you'd mentioned there with the newsletters, which I think is a really good one to note. So we kind of spoke about challenges of B2B marketing itself, but have you experienced any challenges throughout your kind of career in B2B marketing, and how did you kind of overcome those challenges, whether it be going from the financial services into B2B marketing, starting up the consultancy company, you're involved with software as well quite heavily. So how have you kind of experienced those challenges throughout your career and overcome them?
It's not for the faint-hearted, marketing in B2B SaaS, right? It's you got to be very resilient. I think in most lines of work now, resilience is a key skill. And even for younger people listening, it's something that is really important, because people present themselves to the world with a sort of a LinkedIn presence or a CV that suggests it was all linear, up to the right, and everything was rosy, right? So there's no doubt about it. There are lots of challenges, and the longer you go through your career, the more issues you'll confront. So one of the tricky things with the whole function is the tenure is quite short in many instances, often only a year or two. And why? Often in technology companies, the product owner or the CTO or the tech lead, maybe a co-founder, are not, they're integral to the role in terms of building the product. Sales and marketing then are viewed as kind of almost like bolt-ons, that are easy then to kind of have issues with if things aren't going right. So that, that's one of the things that you typically encounter. So that was one of the reasons actually I started my fractional consultancy. Was actually, I thought, well, hold on a minute, by working with a few different players, you're almost a portfolio of different income streams, which de-risks you then against, the wild and wacky scenarios that can occur, which include, needing to relocate overseas at the drop of a hat, versus budgets being collapsed, versus, the whole mix of things. So I think that's one thing to kind of to be aware about. Other challenges is it's definitely very fast moving, and what worked yesterday may not work today, right? Because again, you're dealing with, a constantly moving landscape, right? So, we talked about this earlier a little bit, Jack, but the effectiveness of a content or inbound marketing led approach 10 years ago was vastly different from trying to do it now. Later on, things like AI and sort of, the ability for that to generate content, something that I'm completely against, but what people, do use it for, all of a sudden, we're all drowning in a sea of noise. And we use the same sort of language, 15 or 20 years ago, but every year it just seems to get dialed up a ratchet. So I think there's challenges around, funding, which we talked about earlier. There's challenges around the tenure in the role, which explained part of my motivation to go fractional. There's challenges around the effectiveness of what you did yesterday. And then look, there's also the kind of ongoing challenges with the fact it's a very general role, right? And kind of the requirements can vary greatly depending on the client. So depending on the budget, depending on the team size, depending on the industry sector, depending on the characteristics of the market, the sophisticated nature or not sophisticated nature of the team, right? Whether they have a mature marketing function, not so mature, whether they're trying to optimize for profit or growth. So there's all these things that are swirling around. Now the flip side is I kind of find this quite rewarding, because having worked with 50 plus VC backed companies in the last 10 years, it's easier for someone like myself to be more comfortable in this world, because I view them as challenges, right? I view them as intellectual challenges rather than kind of areas for stress, right? But also there's a bit more pattern recognition, because I've sort of seen some of this stuff play out in the past, and that kind of helps, equip you to deal with it as it plays out in the present.
I think that's like only something experience can get you, in terms of your ability to cope with it, versus maybe someone like myself who's early on in their career that doesn't have that knowledge or experience. Something, a growing team that we're actually having on this podcast is a lot of the guests are actually starting up their own companies, own their own companies, have kind of gone from a job to setting up either a consultancy or an agency. providing the same services that they were doing at the job, but just going down the entrepreneurship route. And I guess a lot of the listeners will be aspiring, maybe business owners, maybe thinking of starting a professional services agency in a service-based business, which obviously isn't anything like e-commerce that is very trendy, but they have a skill and they're trying to, I guess, maximize that by going out on their own. What advice, Alan, would you have to those people who are maybe earlier on in their kind of service-based business journey?
Yeah, I think one thing is that people buy from people, Jack. So building relationships is really important. Arguably, it's more difficult now because many people are working remotely and they're more commonly going to be online rather than in person. So, but I do think you need to make the effort to build in-person relationships, because in some ways it enables you to stay front of mind, but also de-risks it for the other party because they know you and they can probably implicitly trust you from by dint of the relationship. So relationship building, is key. But by that, I mean getting out and meeting people, whether it's for coffees, but clearly if it's coffees, you need to be not in sales mode, but very much in either offering advice or offering something of value or attending events. So definitely the kind of in-person piece is crucial. The other thing to look at is this demand supply piece of the kind of equation, because of course most people come at it from a supply side, right, where I can offer all these services, whereas if all of a sudden something gets saturated quite quickly with lots of people flooding the market at the same time, offering, a similar range of services, and then the demand for whatever reason isn't as strong, you're kind of missing a trick. So therefore, you're into the world of positioning and trying to understand, is there an angle that you have that potentially isn't being well served? And often these angles are, you could be verticals or industries where you're picking a niche and you're saying, I'm in this niche, and of course that niche can be as narrow as you can possibly make it. And that might sound, a bit daunting because you might be thinking, I want to keep it as broad as I can. But I think if you keep it as broad, then you're competing with a much wider group. So these are some of the things to be thinking about. And then you've got to be, demonstrating your value by producing what you're looking to sell. So, when I would have been interviewing marketing people throughout my career, I would typically, Google them before a meeting, Jack, to look at their digital footprint. And by that I meant, could I find evidence that they had either written content? Could I find evidence that they had produced a white paper? Could I found evidence that they had appeared on a podcast or on a tutorial? And if I couldn't, it made it difficult then, for me to take them seriously, because even a basic website on Squarespace or Wix, if you're in digital marketing, if you haven't even gone to the trouble of sort of securing a domain name, setting up your own website, even if it's a basic holding site, it undermines your credibility then in a competitive market, because everyone can be very assertive around, oh, I'm good at SEO and I'm good at PPC and I'm good at content. But really the proof is in, is there tangible and visible evidence that you can, point to? And I think that's something, again, and in your early days, you may not have that, Jack, but then you go and you create it, right? You don't just sit back, you go and you take action. And married to that, then, you can take time to explore tools in, let's call it the MarTech stack, so that you're familiar with tools like HubSpot, because you know that's going to be tool commonly used, and that the senior leaders in the organization aren't going to know the nuts and bolts of how it's used at the practitioner level. So again, making sure that you've got credentials in HubSpot and these other tools to demonstrate that you can know your way around them. And look, finally, Jack, you've got things like AI that's fast emerging as sort of the new norm. Again, senior leaders are not going to have the time or bandwidth to really get into the nuts and bolts of AI. So, carving out a half an hour, going back to the theme of this presentation or this conversation, incremental improvement. So investing half an hour a day in AI, learning it for a particular use case, again, will really help you stand out from the crowd.
Those are great insights, Alan. And you kind of touched on the AI point, and you made a comment earlier on about it as well, in terms of it, the use case being for content creation. I'd have a similar opinion as you on that one. I think we're seeing a lot more people standard comments that they have an AI thing going in the back of their LinkedIn and just replying on comments to basically get engagement up. Um, a lot of scripts and different areas like that. I think scripts in terms of creating video scripts can be great, but like all the captions being done on AI and AI avatars stuff, I think interesting use cases. But I think there'll be an opportunity for people who have their own thoughts and their own, I guess, unique talking points. They will probably win out in the end in terms of unique insights. But what kind of insights or what channels do you see AI having a great use case potentially for B2B companies in the future, whether that be for automating tasks or customer service? What kind of areas do you see it impacting it positively?
I think, look, I do need to explore it in a little bit more detail, right? I kind of sit on the side of the fence that it's best used as a complement rather than a substitute, right? By that I mean, I think if you use it for lazy stuff that's in the public domain, like creating content, I think you're kind of you're sitting on the wrong side of the fence in terms of what AI is good for, because let's be really honest, AI is in content creation is regurgitating other people's content, and it may not even be factually accurate, and of course it lacks all personality and sort of softness, so it's actually pretty poor quality content for people to consume. However, it can be very useful, and this goes back to the kind of the use cases of it, for helping someone structure an outline at the start, or fact checking, or spell checking, or shortening a long paper into 1,000 words, or so being kind of helping with the efficiency side of things. I think where it starts getting problematic, though, is once it starts hitting the public domain as content. And I think we're already seeing some of that in the UK with these videos going viral of Southgate that's not really, he's saying stuff that he's not saying, right? So they're using AI tools to masquerade. I think that's beginning to emerge, and that sort of stuff, collectively we're all probably not equipped to deal with it, because governments are lagging technology companies in some of this. So I guess my kind of rule of thumb is, explore and try it out on stuff that's internal efficiency, time saving, resource saving. But I wouldn't be using it for stuff that's being pushed into the public domain. And even like customer service, I mean, that can be very frustrating for people when, it can be okay for basic requests, but once there's something that's sort of outside the realm of normal requests, it can be very frustrating very quickly, right? So that's a classic example of, if the AI recognizes that, whoa, we don't really have an answer for this, we've given an answer that hasn't been accepted, then you push it through to someone, and in person, that makes sense. Whereas if you try then and just do the support entirely on AI, you're looking for trouble.
It's going to be an interesting one on how it kind of, the whole landscape, especially with marketing, how it kind of fits into it, and more importantly, doesn't fit into it. Because I think, the regulation and the data privacy element of it is definitely something that they have not figured out, in terms of where's the data being stored and data leaks. I think that would be a big issue in the future that they need some high security on. But we will have to wait and see. For B2B companies right now in maybe 2024, what is working well for maybe clients you've seen? What's been working well, and maybe like some anticipation of maybe what's going to happen in the future over the next couple of years. Obviously, it's very hard to tell exactly what's going to happen, but from your experience, what's working well, and what might happen in the future for B2B companies if they were to grow and succeed.
I think what I'd say with what works well, Jack, is it's very context specific, right? So I don't think, you can kind of say, oh, paid acquisition is working well, therefore, it really is very, very nuanced. And the playbooks that we all have, right, working in this profession, need to be tweaked and modified. So, I've some companies I'm working with, and direct sales is highly personalized direct sales is proving effective, but in others it's not proving as effective, and probably because one market is more saturated than the other. I think if you've got a very disruptive tech and a strong product, then it gives you more ammunition to be trying lots of different activities. Whereas if you're in a fairly crowded category, it's back to deep pockets are important. I do think we will start seeing a couple of trends, though, Jack. I do think They will be, more short form over long form. So the days of long white papers, I think, will be gone. People will be much more interested in a short 1 or 2 pager. I think video will start taking over from written content. Part of it helps deal with some of this AI stuff for now, because that you're listening to someone that's authentic and credible and hopefully articulate. Whereas written content is probably less assured. So I think there's some of the things that we'll start seeing changes in. Look, the macro is very uncertain at the moment. Election years are always difficult for B2B companies, particularly when the US and UK, which will be two big B2B SaaS markets, are in election years. You tend to have a kind of dampening of demand in those years. So obviously both of those are not your typical election in terms of likely outcomes, and that will definitely play a role in how things play out. So look, I remain optimistic. Like, technology is still a great enhancement. B2B SaaS software, more and more of these applications are benefiting us all, often in very obscure and niche verticals. And this is the other thing, the beauty of the kind of software world we live in, is that the first tranche of software on the market was very mass market. It kind of had to be by default. Whereas now you're getting, all these much narrower, more obscure verticals that are growing and can be managed with software applications. So I think there'll continue to be an explosion of tools and software applications that just help us be more efficient. And I guess the way to think of it, Jack, is as long as we're still doing stuff in the likes of Excel, that's often a kind of a natural jump off point where people say, okay, if people are doing a lot of certain tasks in Excel, maybe now that can be lifted and shifted into a software world. And that has definitely been, like, expense management might be an easy example. People would have in the past perhaps used or tracking tasks or whatever, might have used Excel to track tasks or to manage expenses. Just two simple examples of things that are now available via SaaS, right? And of course, competitive pressures mean the price points of these applications are getting, very competitive. So all of a sudden, I think you will start using more tools and applications that just genuinely save you time and energy over doing it manually.
And Alan, thank you very much for sharing your 1% insights today. Where can our listeners find you?
Yeah, thanks, Jack. So delighted to be on the show. So the two, LinkedIn is an obvious one, just Alan Gleeson, you'll find me there. I think if you Google Alan Gleeson, you'll find me as well. I think I've done some good SEO work over the years. So GLEESON, and you'll find me there as well on Google.
Thank you, Alan. Appreciate it.